Hello, I'm Keith Hocton, author, historian, and host of Rearview Mirror Chronicles, where we take a look back at the people and the moments that shaped our world through history. All his life, he had been walking towards this hour, though no man had ever spoken it plainly to him. The old wisdom says, cattle die, kinsmen die, and you yourself will also die. But the name of a man who has done well will never perish. And so a man does not turn aside when his road narrows. He knows that reputation outlives the body, and that there are moments when fate leaves no second path. Behind him lay oaths and reckonings. In the north it was said that the brave man does not live forever, but the coward never truly lives at all. Blood calls for blood, and a promise once spoken follows a man like a shadow. The sagas don't tell us these things as glory, but as burden. Because a man is not made in peace, he is revealed when the cost is laid before him. And so he goes forward, as others have done before him, not because he seeks the crown, but because he cannot step away from it. For in the end, as the old poets knew, fate is not to be fled. A man may doubt, he may fear, but when his moment comes, he must stand. And in that moment, he has become what he always was. So folks, this is where we left him in episode 1, Harald Hardrada. Not at the beginning of this story, but at the very edge of it. And now, in part 2, we watch what a man does when there is no road left but forward. This is the second chapter in Harald's life. A fugitive from Norway, exile, a survivor, a young man of 20-something standing in the greatest city on earth, Constantinople, the new Rome, a golden city of emperors, and within it, the most feared bodyguard in the known world, the Varangian Guard. The year is 1035, and almost at once the world comes to meet him. News reaches the imperial court that Arab corsairs have swept into the Aegean, raiding the Greek islands, burning settlements, and carrying men, women, and children into slavery. This is no distant rumor. This is immediate. It's urgent. The empire responds, and Harald goes with it. And so, without ceremony, his real education begins. For the next 6 years, 6, maybe 7, his life becomes a blur of motion and violence. War galleys cutting through dark water before dawn, oars rising and falling in silence, the crash of a hull against shore, men leaping into the surf, shields raised, the climb up shattered walls, the sudden intimate brutality of the sword. It's a life that's lived at speed and on the edge. But there's a problem. Almost everything we think we know about these years come from the sagas, written down literally 2 centuries later in Iceland by men who lived in a very different world entirely. Christian writers looking back at a pagan past, sharing stories as much as preserving them. There's an embellishment here. There's a pattern. There's literary craft, heroes made sharper, moments made cleaner than they ever were. Which means certainty is impossible. And yet there are voices from the empire itself. The Byzantines, who still thought of themselves as Romans, left records of the wars they fought. And these give us something firmer beneath our feet. Not a full picture, but enough to trace the outline of a life in motion. In the spring of 1035, those records speak of pirate fleets striking into the Aegean, ships from North Africa attacking the Cyclades. Here, for once, the sagas and the Greek chroniclers align. Different worlds, different times, but they tell the same story. There was fighting, and Harald was almost certainly there. By the summer, the horizon shifts. The Varangian Guard is sent east to the edges of the empire, to Armenia, where the Byzantine army is locked in a campaign along the shores of Lake Van. A city called Berkeri stands under siege. This isn't a simple war. The great Abbasid Caliphate has fractured. sprinkling into rival emirates. There's Arab, there's Turkish, there's Kurdish. Powers rising and falling, alliances shifting, loyalties incredibly uncertain. And it's a world of overlapping claims and constant tension. A frontier, if you like, where nothing is stable and everything is contested. And into this world steps Harald Hardrada. Not yet a king, not yet a legend, but already exactly where he is meant to be. The campaign in Armenia brings Harald into a kind of warfare that his people have never truly embraced. Sieges. For men of the north, war is movement. It's very fluid. It's the sudden strike, the clash in open ground, the clean violence of a ship against the shore. A siege requires patience and hunger, and there's a lot of waiting, and it's a very slow tightening of the hand. And yet, at Berkeri, on the shores of Lake Van, the Roman army settles in to do exactly that. And against expectation, it actually works. The sagas, written long after the victory of Harald, they shape this moment in the way that they always do, placing the young warrior at the center of events, the man upon whom success turns. But the reality is almost certainly different. The army at Berkeri is commanded by one of the most formidable generals of his age, a man whose reputation looms as large as any in the Byzantine world, General George Menakes. Like Harald, he is remembered as a giant. The sources, as ever, they can't resist exaggeration. They speak of an immense height. Some say he was 9 feet tall, and his face was always set in a permanent scowl, a temper that burned like fire. A man who moved, it was said, with the speed of a lion, and when he walked, the ground itself seemed to tremble. One learns, in this world to treat such descriptions with caution, of course, but exaggeration often grows around something real. And what is real is this. Menakes was a force of nature, and he and Harald didn't get on. The sagas hint at tension, they hint at rivalry, even at open hostility. They tell us that the Varangians themselves demanded that Harald be given command. An unlikely claim, I think, but a revealing one, because what it suggests is a fracture, a clash of personalities too large to coexist together. Whatever the truth, the outcome's clear enough. Harald is recalled to Constantinople, and from there, sent on something altogether different. Not a siege, something far more symbolic. At some point in these years, the emperor reaches an agreement with the rulers of Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is one of the most sacred sites in all of Christendom, and it had been devastated a generation earlier. The destruction was carried out in the year 1009 under the rule of the Caliph al-Hakim bin Amir Allah, and it sent shockwaves across the Christian world. This was no ordinary building. It was believed to stand on the site of Christ's crucifixion and burial, the very heart, if you like, of Christian devotion. News of its ruins spread slowly, but when it arrived in the West, it actually struck deep. It fed a growing unease, a sense that the world itself was shifting, that something had gone wrong in its spiritual center. Over time, the anxieties would gather force, becoming part of the long current that would, decades later, bring in the form of the First Crusade, called by Pope Urban II. But in Harold's time, the task isn't war, but restoration. Permission has been granted to rebuild, and with it comes a gesture of power. An imperial escort is sent to Jerusalem, and among them, if the sagas are to be believed, is Harald Hardrada. If indeed he did make that journey, what he found was not a city of glory, but one of damage and repair. Jerusalem in the 1030s was still scarred, not only by destruction, but by earthquakes that had shaken the entire region. Walls had cracked, buildings were broken, sacred spaces in ruin or half restored. It's a holy city for sure, but it's a wounded one. The sagas, never shy of generosity, tell us that Harald gave lavishly, that he donated great quantities of gold to the rebuilding effort, a gesture fitting for a man already being shaped into legend. And yet it's here that the story kind of falters. Other accounts suggest that he had already sent all of his wealth back to Constantinople for safekeeping. So both of those can't be true. It has to be one or the other. And so we're left, as so often with Harald, in that uncertain space between history and story. A man moving through real events, leaving behind something harder to pin down. Not fact, but reputation. If indeed Harald did pass through Jerusalem, he didn't linger there for long, because by this stage something very important is becoming clear about him. And that is that he's not simply fighting, he's accumulating wealth above all else. And it's flowing towards him like a river. He's completing campaigns, he's getting rewarded, he's got imperial favor. And unlike many men of his particular world, he doesn't squander it, but instead he stores it carefully. And I think he did send it back to Constantinople, where it could be kept safe, where he could build it piece by piece. And I think the reason he's building this war chest, if you like, is for something that still lies in the future. The sagas, as they so often do, pause to give us a moment of symbolism, kind of telling us that Harald traveled to the River Jordan and bathed there in the manner of pilgrims, marking the act with ritual and quiet reverence. And for once, there is no strong reason to doubt this, because it's entirely in keeping with the man that we're beginning to see emerge. A warrior, certainly, but also someone who understood the importance of faith, of image, and perhaps even of destiny. If Jerusalem offered reflection, however, Sicily, I think, offers something very different, because from around 1038 to 1041, Harald finds himself drawn into one of the great theaters of Mediterranean warfare on an island that has been contested for centuries and whose importance has never really diminished. Sicily was fertile, it was wealthy, and perfectly positioned. And although it had been under Islamic rule for over a century, governed by the Kalbid emirs from Palermo, it remained a prize that no great power could entirely ignore, not least because it had become a place of real sophistication, enriched by new crops, new systems of irrigation, and also a kind of layered culture that made it both prosperous and strategically vital. It's precisely this richness that draws the Byzantine Empire back. And so an army, perhaps 10,000 strong, lands on the island under the command of that same formidable figure, General George Monarchis, a man whose reputation, even allowing for exaggeration, suggests a personality as large and difficult as any in the empire. And if there had been tension between him and Harald before, it's difficult to imagine that it softened here, because what we seem to have are two very powerful men, each accustomed to command, now operating in the same space that is rarely a comfortable arrangement. It's at this point that the sagas begin to expand, almost visibly, as though they recognize that they've arrived at a stage upon which legend can properly take hold. And they give us a series of episodes that are so vivid, so neatly constructed, that they feel less like records and more like stories, if you like, that have settled into their final form over time. One of the most famous of these is the Tale of the Birds, in which Harald is said to have ordered his men to capture birds and attach burning material to their feet, and then release them over the town so that they would settle on the rooftops and set the place alight. A story which has undeniable appeal, but also a certain familiarity, because it appears elsewhere in history, most notably in connection with Olga of Kiev. So we're left in that slightly uncertain space where we have to decide whether this is actually a borrowed motif, repeated because it works so bloody well, or whether Harald, having spent time in Kiev, may simply have heard the story and thought it worth attempting for himself. There's also the account of a siege near Mount Etna, where a city proves stubbornly resistant and where, according to the sagas, Monarchis is reduced to frustration while Harald steps forward with a solution, offering to take the city if he is granted the loot, and then proceeding to have his men dig a tunnel from a nearby ravine until they break through, not in the streets, but directly into the hall where the defenders are feasting, at which point the entire scene collapses into sudden violence. The gates are opened from within, and the city falls in a manner that is almost, I think too perfectly arranged not to raise future questions. And then there is Syracuse, which gives us perhaps the most elaborate story of all, because here the problem isn't simply resistance, but stalemate. And so Harald, if we follow the saga tradition, turns to deception, allowing word to spread that he's fallen gravely ill, and that eventually he dies before sending messengers into the city to request permission for a Christian burial. The request, of course, is granted, though cautiously, and only a small group is allowed entry, 12 men in all, carrying the body of their commander. And it's at this point that the story reveals itself fully, because the body isn't a body at all, but a very live Harald himself, concealed within the wrappings, surrounded by armed companions beneath their mourning clothes, who at the chosen moment rise, draw their weapons, and seize the gates from within. It's actually a magnificent piece of storytelling, and perhaps that's exactly what it is. But whether or not these events happened in quite this way in some respects, it's actually less important than what they suggest, because they point to the shape of the man as he was remembered, not merely as a warrior of strength, but as someone capable of cunning, of great calculation, and of a kind of theatrical boldness that borders on the audacious. And by the time he leaves Sicily, whatever the precise truth behind these stories may be, that reputation has begun to settle around him. Not yet a king, not yet a legend in the full sense, but already something more than ordinary, something more than an ordinary man, if you like, moving through events. He's already becoming a great figure who seems to bend those events slightly towards himself. And of course, the sagas don't leave Harald alone in these moments, but instead they surround him with companions who seem, like him, to exist slightly above the ordinary run of men. Figures as described as possessing exceptional strength and presence, a bit like Hercules. The kind of warriors who were remembered not simply for what they did, but for how they seemed while doing it. Harald himself is said to be 7.5 feet tall. The truth, as so often, probably lies somewhere between the two, because while the sagas undoubtedly shape their material, they don't tend to invent from nothing. There is something here that feels grounded, even if it's been sharpened with time. The story that follows is told with complete assurance. The funeral ruse at Syracuse unfolds exactly as intended. The small group admitted through the gates, the body wrapped in linen, under the watchful eyes of the defenders. Everything's held together by a fragile tension of deception until, at precisely the right moment, balance breaks. The body in the shroud is dropped, a trumpet sounds, and the narrow space of the gatehouse is thrown into confusion as Harald himself blocks the entrance, turning what had been a solemn procession into something altogether different. Because in that instant, the Varangians shed the appearance of mourners and become what they truly are, dangerously armed men in the heart of an enemy stronghold, prepared to die for their cause. And what follows is close, brutal fighting, the kind that actually leaves no room for maneuver and very little for thought. And it's here that the sagas give us one of the moments that feels almost too vivid to dismiss entirely. An actual fragment of character caught in motion. Harald's standard bearer is cut down, the banner falls, and in the chaos he calls out for it to be raised again, ordering one of his companions to take it up. But that man, already engaged, already fighting for his life against multiple attackers, turns back and refuses. Not cautiously, not respectfully, but bluntly, telling Harald in no uncertain terms to carry it himself. In a way, it's a remarkable exchange, because what that reveals is something about the relationship between these men, something that sits outside strict hierarchy. And Harold's response is just as telling, because rather than anger, what comes is laughter, a great unrestrained burst of it in the middle of combat, as though he recognizes in that refusal something he values greatly: stubbornness, courage, a refusal to bend even under pressure. Then the moment passes, of course, as such moments must, and the fighting resumes. The gate is taken from within, and the city, at least in the telling of the saga, falls. And yet, when you step back from the detail of the story and look at the broader picture, a different reality asserts itself, because for all the ingenuity, all the violence, all the color of these accounts, Sicily isn't conquered, not by Harold, not by the Byzantines, and what they achieve amounts in the end to little more than a foothold in the northeast of the island. A very limited success rather than a decisive victory. The island itself remains out of their grasp, and it won't be until later in the century that it finally falls. And when it does, it's not taken by the empire, but by the Normans, themselves descendants of Scandinavian settlers who established themselves in southern Italy before turning their attention across the water. Even here, the echoes remain, because another story is told, this time of Roger I of Sicily, who, after defeating a Muslim force, is said to have captured carrier pigeons used by his enemies and sent them back bearing messages dripped in blood, spreading news of defeat ahead of his advance. And whether or not the story is true, almost, it's beside the point, because what matters is the pattern that runs through all of this, a reoccurring blend of ingenuity, violence, and just enough theatricality to ensure that the memory endures. And of course, by now, this is exactly what is forming around Harold. Not just a record of his actions, but a reputation, something larger, something that begins to move ahead of him, shaping how he's seen as he continues to move through the world. The campaign against the Bulgars marks another step in Harold's rise, because it's here, for once, we move into slightly firmer ground, because this isn't just saga material, but supported by contemporary Byzantine writing, and that's important. The army marches, the fighting is hard, and the outcome is decisive. The Bulgars are crushed, their ruler captured, he's mutilated in the brutal fashion of the age, and he's sent back in chains to Constantinople as a living symbol of imperial victory. In the aftermath of that campaign, Harold is actually singled out for distinction. And this matters because it tells us, whatever the embellishments of the sagas, there was something real beneath them, something recognized by the empire itself. He's awarded the title of Sparta Rocandius, a court rank rather than a purely military one, but prestigious all the same, and particularly so for a foreigner, let alone a young man from the northern edge of the known world. Along with it comes honor, great reward, and the kind of visible symbols that mattered in Byzantium: fine weapons, ceremonial dress, and the outward sign that mark a man as rising within the imperial system. All of this, and he's only about 25. By this point, Harold has done more than survive. He's actually established himself, and in a city like Constantinople, where reputation travels quickly and favor can be as valuable as skill, that matters enormously. But while Harold is building his future, the world around him is beginning to shift in a very different direction. Because at the heart of the empire, the situation is becoming unstable, and what had felt from a distance like a grand and ordered court begins to take on a more familiar, darker tone, something closer to intrigue than authority. The Emperor Michael IV is a man whose rise has never been entirely comfortable, having come to power through influence, manipulation, and very possibly murder, aided by his brother, the eunuch John, a figure of immense political skill and control who operates behind the throne with a quiet but decisive authority. And together, they've built a network of power, placing family members into positions of influence, rewarding loyalty, and consolidating control in a way that feels, even at the time, precarious. And now that structure begins to weaken. Michael IV has long suffered from illness, but by the early 1040s, it's worsening, and it's no longer something that can be managed discreetly behind curtains and ceremony, but something very visible and undeniable. His body begins to fail him, swelling with fluid, his strength draining away, and those around him understand what this means. Not simply the decline of a man, but the imminent question of succession, the moment when everything has been built could collapse if it's not carefully managed. So John moves quickly. A successor has to be named, and more importantly, it must be someone who keeps power within their circle. Conveniently, there is another Michael, a relative brought forward, adopted if you like, elevated and positioned carefully so that when the moment comes, that transition will appear smooth and almost inevitable. And I think for a very short time it works. In December 1041, Michael IV, now dying, is taken into a monastery. He's formally tonsured, stripped of imperial identity in preparation for death, and there, having relinquished the trappings of power, he dies. The succession unfolds exactly as planned. The new emperor, Michael V, steps into place, and for a brief moment, it seems as though the system has held. But beneath that smooth surface lies something far more volatile, because there is one figure who cannot be ignored: Zoe. By now in her later years, she is nevertheless the living embodiment of legitimacy, the last direct link to the Macedonian dynasty, and in a court obsessed with lineage, that really matters more than anything else. She's already seen power rise and fall around her and has already been used, sidelined, and then restored, and now once again finds herself at the center of events. And this time, the relationship turns sour. Michael V, once dependent upon her, now rejects her completely, not simply distancing himself, but actively turning against her, surrounding himself with his own supporters, dismantling the old network of influence, and I think also in particular removing those closest to the previous regime. What begins as political judgment hardens quickly into something more personal, more hostile, until the situation becomes untenable. Then, on Easter in 1042, the break comes. Without warning, guards enter her chambers, they seize her, and they drag her before the emperor, where she's accused, whether truthfully or not, scarcely matters at this stage, of conspiracy and treachery. The judgment is immediate. She is to be removed, sent away from the centers of power, exiled to a monastery on the islands in the Sea of Marmara. And I also have to say, there is no dignity in this process. She is stripped of her imperial robes, her hair is cut short to the skull, her status erased in the most visible way possible, reduced in the eyes of those watching. And really, she goes from empress to something closer to nothing. You know, the transformation is deliberate, symbolic, a message not just about her, but also power itself and how quickly it can be taken away. And yet, as so often in Constantinople, the act isn't the end of the story, because the removal of Zoe isn't simply a political maneuver, it's a mistake. Michael V had made a catastrophic miscalculation, because whatever his intentions, whatever his private resentments, he had entirely failed to understand the city he ruled. A major mistake, and more importantly, the woman he had just tried to erase. Zoe was not simply a former empress, not merely a figure at court. She was something much deeper, something woven into the identity of Constantinople itself, born into the imperial line, raised within the palace, a constant presence across decades of shifting power. And for the people of the city, she was a figure both familiar and symbolic, the last living thread connecting them to a dynasty that they understood. And so when word spread, as it inevitably did, that she had been seized, humiliated, and sent away, the reaction was immediate. By Easter Monday, the city was in motion. Crowds gathered, not cautiously, not quietly, but with a kind of rising certainty that something had gone wrong, that a boundary had been crossed. And once that feeling takes hold, it rarely dissipates gently. The prefect was sent to address the crowd, to explain, to justify, to restore order. But the words had no effect because the mood had already shifted beyond persuasion, and what followed wasn't protest, but eruption. The forum would have dissolved into chaos, buildings would have been ransacked, symbols of authority smashed, and that unrest spreads quickly, drawing in more and more of the population until it becomes larger than a riot, something closer, if you like, to a collective act of rejection. From there, the movement surged forward towards the great cathedral, where the patriarch was forced into action, the bells ringing out across the city, not in celebration, but in alarm, calling people together, amplifying the sense that something momentous was unfolding. And of course, then fires began to take hold. Smoke would have risen above the rooftops, drifting upward in dark columns, while the streets below were filled with movement and violence and confusion. And somewhere within that chaos, voices began to shape the moment into something far more deliberate. The Varangians, whose loyalty lay with the imperial house rather than any single ruler, would have been unlikely to look kindly on what had been done. And alongside them were other factions, rival groups within the city, each with their own interests, with their own grievances, their own sense that this was the moment to act. And I think what you're looking at here is what began as outrage was fast becoming something far more organized. And of course, what we know by the records is that by the afternoon, the city had divided. On one side, you have the emperor and his supporters, including the foreign guards he had brought close to him, and on the other, a shifting but increasingly coordinated force made up of the populace, elements of the military, and of course the Varangians themselves. The streets became battlegrounds, fighting, breaking out in confined spaces, spreading unpredictably, of course, and all the while the center of power, the palace, stood as the ultimate objective. And what started at the weekend, well, by Tuesday, the crisis reached its height. The attackers forced their way into the palace complex, some of them entering through the imperial box at the hippodrome, using passages that connected spectacle to power, moving from public arena into the private heart of the empire, and from there pushing forward room by room until resistance began to collapse. But of course, Michael was long gone. He'd fled, slipping away with his uncle to the palace docks, where imperial vessels lay ready. And from there, they attempted escape, not far, not out into open water, but simply away, down along the shoreline to a monastery very near the city walls, a place of sanctuary, or so they hoped. And of course, behind them, the city was changing hands. Zoe was brought back, retrieved from exile, her head shaved, her dignity stripped, but her significance intact. And alongside her, another figure was drawn from obscurity, her sister, Theodora, long confined to a monastery and now suddenly returned to the center of events. Together, they were presented to the people, not as victims, but as rulers of co-empresses, the living embodiment of continuity restored. The decision was immediate. Michael had to be removed. The rioters, now something closer to a force, made their way to the monastery where he had taken refuge, and whatever the formal protections of sanctity might once have meant, they meant very little now. He was dragged out, along with his uncle, into the open, into the full glare of consequence. And it's here, I think, that the story actually turns briefly from politics to character, because faced with the end, Michael doesn't meet it with dignity, nor with defiance, I have to say, but with fear, clinging to the altar, then to the pillars, pleading, weeping, attempting to shift blame, to deny responsibility, to escape in whatever way he can. This isn't the response of a ruler, not even of a man reconciled to his fate. And in the telling, it stands in sharp contrast, I think, to the ideals of the age, to the notion so often repeated that a man should meet his end with composure, with words, with some final assertion of self. Instead, he's overpowered, he's dragged down. And then, as was common in Byzantine practice, he's blinded, his eyes gouged out to render him incapable of ruling. A punishment that removes power without necessarily taking life. Though the distinction, I have to say, is a narrow one. And somewhere within this moment, the sagas place Harald. They say that he's there, that he was the one who carried out the act, that it was with his hand that ended the reign of an emperor. It's a striking claim, and one that later writers repeat with confidence, pointing to verse composed at the time which credits a northern warrior with the deed, arguing that such a detail would not have been invented without reason. Whether it's true, I mean, it's another matter, but that it was believed that it became part of Harald's story, I think tells us something very important, because by now, he is no longer simply a participant in events. He's actually becoming a very significant figure within them. The story, as it's handed down, insists on its own authority, because we're told that Harald himself, along with others who had been present, spread this account. And that detail matters because it reflects the way history was understood in the medieval world. Not as something formally documented in the modern sense, but as something carried, something repeated and reinforced through reputation, testimony, and memory. And so within that framework, the conclusion is presented with confidence that Harald Hardrada was indeed the man who carried out the blinding of the emperor, and that the consistency of the sources, however late, give weight to that claim. Michael, in any case, doesn't survive his fall, dying, some months later from his own wounds, while other details, darker still, circulate in the sources, including the possibility of castration, though here the accounts diverge, I have to say, and certainly slips away once again into suggestion and rumor, as they often do. In the immediate aftermath, power settles, at least for a moment, into a new configuration as Zoe and Theodora rule together briefly as co-empresses, before Zoe marries once more, raising her new husband to the throne as Constantine IX. And with that, the court rearranges itself yet again, the surface calm restored, though the underlying tensions never entirely disappear. I mean, how could they? For Harald, however, this turn of events appears, at least outwardly, to have worked entirely in his favor, because the Varangians emerge strengthened from the crisis. Their position at court reinforced, their loyalty rewarded, and within that structure, Harald rises still further. Now, not merely as a soldier of fortune, but as a figure of influence, a young commander, a man whose presence now extends beyond the battlefield into political life of the empire. Money continues to flow, honors accumulate, and the sense builds that he has succeeded in exactly what he came south to do, to gather wealth, to build a reputation, and to place himself in a position from which something greater might eventually be claimed. And for a time, everything seems aligned. He's still a young man. He's already rich beyond anything available to most in the north. He's established within the most glittering court in the world and moving at the very center of power. A foreigner no longer on the margins, but fully embedded within the imperial system. And of course, then that pattern breaks. One night, he's woken by a violent hammering at his door, a sound that carries none of the ceremony of court life and all of the urgency of danger. And when he opens it, he finds guards waiting outside, their expressions cold, formal, and unmistakable in their intent. And in Constantinople, that combination rarely brings good news. And with that, his story turns once again. And let's just take a quick break, and we'll be back in a second with part 2. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. There is, I think, however, another strand to the story, one that sits uneasily along Harald's rise and comes to us, as so much of his life does, through the sagas, colored, shaped, and not entirely trustworthy, I have to say, but yet too persistent to ignore. At its center stands a woman, Maria, a figure who does seem to have existed at the Byzantine court and who is described in terms that feel at once vivid and curiously familiar. Although she's said to have been strikingly beautiful, she actually possessed something far more elusive, a charm in conversation, a musical quality to her voice that's mentioned in the sagas, and a way of speaking that could hold attention and draw people in. A portrait that echoes classical descriptions so closely that one can't but suspect the hand of literary tradition shaping the account, even as it claims to preserve memory. And yet, for all that, she was real, a presence moving within the intricate world of courtly influence and proximity to power. And whether Harald was drawn into that orbit, whether there was any connection between them beyond rumor, I think that's far less certain, though the sagas insist that something occurred, something that drew attention and perhaps displeasure. Because suddenly, and with very little warning, the narrative shifts from advancement to danger as Harald is seized and bound and cast into prison. The setting in which he finds himself is described with a kind of grim theatricality. You know, a high tower open above, its entrance at ground level. It's very J.R.R. Tolkien, where darkness and dampness combine with kind of the lingering presence of those who had been thrown there before, so that it actually feels less like a prison in the ordinary sense and more like a place where men are forgotten rather than held. And of course, Harald wouldn't have been alone. He would have been accompanied by his Varangian companions, those same figures who have followed him through battle, and together they now occupy a space that seems almost designed to invite and, I have to say, invent legend, because what follows moves quickly beyond the boundaries of the plausible. From the shadows emerges a serpent, described as large, venomous, and entirely at home in that place, feeding, so the story goes, on the bodies of the dead, an image that belongs more naturally to myth than to record, yet one that is presented without hesitation, as though it were simply part of that environment into which these men have been cast. Harald apparently confronts it, not as a victim, but as a protagonist, using a length of wood to control its movement before striking, driving a blade into it and ending the threat in a manner that feels less like an incident and more like a test drawn from an older, historic tradition. If the episode with the serpent edges towards the fantastic, what follows pushes still further, because in the darkness of that prison, Harald is said to receive a vision in which his dead brother, Olaf II of Norway, appears not as a spectre of fear, but as a figure of reassurance, telling him that his situation, however bleak, will not be the end of him, and that there is a way out that his story hasn't yet reached its conclusion. Whether this is meant as a literal visitation or as a narrative device, I think it hardly matters because what follows seems to fulfill it. A woman's voice comes at the door, unseen, unnamed, but purposeful, claiming to have been guided by a dream in which she was instructed to come and rescue him. And again, the boundary between the possible and the symbolic is left deliberately ambiguous because the sagas thrive in that ambiguity. A rope is then lowered, and one by one they climb, drawn up and out of the darkness and into the black, into the world above, emerging not into safety, but into movement, because now the story accelerates at a faster pace. They would have moved through the city with urgency and, of course, familiarity, reaching the Varangian barracks, gathering weapons and allies, and then pressing on towards the harbor, where 2 galleys are seized and pushed out into the waters of the Golden Horn. The oars biting as they drive forward, the sense of freedom almost within reach, until it's suddenly checked by the great chain that stretches across the entrance. The ancient defensive barrier that seals the harbor from within and from out, and it's done so for generations. For a moment, the sagas tell us that everything hangs in the balance, success poised on the edge of failure, until Harald, in the manner that the sagas have now finally established for him, finds a solution, not through strength alone, but through ingenuity, ordering his men to shift their weight, forcing the ship down at the stern so that the bow rises, rocking them upwards and forward until the effort and no small degree of risk, they pass over the chain, an act that feels almost improbable, and yet it's told within the sagas with absolute complete conviction. Of course, not all of them survive the attempt because one vessel breaks and men are lost into the water, but the remainder hold together. And as dawn begins to spread across the horizon, they turn northward, away from Constantinople, away from the danger, towards the Black Sea and an area that they're familiar with that lies beyond it. I mean, it's an absolutely extraordinary escape, almost too extraordinary. And it leaves us once again, I think, with that familiar question. How much of this is true? Because there are other, quieter explanations that might account for his departure. A political rupture, a shift in favor, a growing tension within the court, or even the wider movements of power beyond the city, all of which might have made departure not just desirable, but a necessity. The truth, however, well, it remains elusive. What can be said with confidence is that by around 1043, Harald has absolutely left Constantinople behind, carrying with him not only considerable wealth, much of it already sent north in advance, but something far more important, a reputation that has been forged and shaped and amplified in one of the most complex and dangerous courts in the world. So that when he does return north, he doesn't do so as a fugitive or a wanderer, but as a man of consequence, one whose name now carries weight and whose story, however uncertain in its details, has already begun to outgrow the life that produced it. The return north is not simply a homecoming, nor even a reunion, but a recalibration of power, because by the time Harald reaches Kiev, he's no longer the young exile who fled Norway with little more than ambition, but a man that's been transformed by a decade in the south, carrying not only immense wealth, but something just as valuable: his reputation, his experience, and also a sense of having moved at the very center and survived at the most sophisticated court in the known world. For Yaroslav the Wise, the ruler of Kiev, this matters enormously because a man like Harald is not simply a returning adventurer, but a potential ally, someone who has proved himself in Constantinople, someone who absolutely commands loyalty and who can raise men, and who, if restored to power in Scandinavia, might become a valuable partner in the shifting geopolitics of the North. And so the question of marriage, long deferred, now returns with an urgency and purpose. Harald is no longer a risk but an asset, a figure of prestige, almost a celebrity, if you like, in the terms of the age. You know, the kind of man whose name travels ahead of him, whose story attracts followers, and whose presence alone can draw support. And so Yaroslav the Wise allows the marriage of his daughter to go ahead. Harald is united with Lisiv of Kiev in a ceremony conducted according to Orthodox rites, which would have been incredibly rich in symbolism, in ritual, in the visible assertions of alliance. And if there is a celebration, there's also a calculation, because this isn't simply a union of two individuals, but of interests, of futures, of ambitions that extend beyond the moment itself. You know, the chroniclers note the wealth that accompanies it, the treasure accumulated during his years in the south, now tied to this marriage. And the detail is telling, because for Harald, wealth has never been an end in itself, but a means, a tool to be used in pursuit of something very much larger. Because for all the glamour of Constantinople, for all the opportunities it offered, his focus never ever shifted. The kingdom of Norway remained at the center of his thinking. The throne, which he believed is his by right, remains the objective, and alongside it the memory of his brother, Olaf II of Norway, whose death still shapes his sense of purpose. Not simply as loss, but as something to be answered, something, I think, to be resolved through action rather than reflection. The South has given him wealth and status and experience, but it hasn't replaced the North in his imagination, and if anything, it sharpened his determination to return. And yet, as the years have passed, the world that he wants to return to isn't the one that he left. You know, in the years of his absence, the great figure who had dominated northern politics, Canute, the great king, well, he's died. And with him, the fragile unity of his North Sea empire. Well, that's collapsed, leaving behind a fractured landscape in which old rivalries have kind of reemerged and new opportunities have opened. England has now passed into the hands of Edward the Confessor, while in Norway, power resists with Harald's nephew, Magnus, the illegitimate son of his brother. And in Denmark, authority is contested and claimed by rivals with their own connections to the new order. It's absolutely a world that is being defined by instability. Norway and Denmark are locked in a prolonged struggle, a shifting contest in which alliances form and dissolve. And I think within that contest, Harald sees both opportunity and danger, because if he moves quickly, he can insert himself as a third force, a claimant with both legitimacy and resources. But if he delays, if Magnus consolidates power, then the chance may never come. It may close. And what's possible now soon becomes the impossible. And so the timing becomes absolutely everything. By the mid-1040s, perhaps around 1045, Harald makes his move, traveling north and arriving in Sweden at Sigtuna, a place that serves as a gateway into the Scandinavian world he intends to reclaim. And it's there that he receives news that changes the calculation entirely, because Magnus has already acted, moving faster than Harald had thought, securing the advantage, and he now stands not merely as King of Norway, but as ruler of both Norway and Denmark. His rival reduced to a subordinate position. And of course, this matters because Magnus is no weak placeholder. He's young, he's capable, he's a ruler who has already demonstrated political skill, able to win support, to stabilize his position, and of course to project authority in a way that makes him far more than a temporary obstacle. He was known as Magnus the Good, and that title itself suggests not kindness, but effectiveness, a man who understands power and how to hold it, who speaks well, decides quickly, and presents himself as both noble and generous. Qualities that in this world are not decorative, but they're actually essential to survival. So Harold finds himself once again at a threshold. He absolutely has the wealth. He has the reputation. He has the ambition, but the path ahead is no longer open. And if he wants it, he's going to have to take it. Harold returns north not as a supplicant, but as a contender. And yet, for all his wealth and reputation, he remains, at least initially, the underdog, because when he finally meets his nephew Magnus in the autumn of 1045, at a place called Skina in what was then Denmark and is now actually in southern Sweden, he's confronting not a placeholder but an established king with power already consolidating. The sagas inevitably shape the meeting into something almost theatrical, as they always do, describing how Magnus, waiting with his fleet, sees a ship approaching from the east, its dragon head adorned with gold and jewels, a vessel that announces not just arrival, but intention. And from it comes a messenger, formal, composed, asking whether Harold would be received. Magnus, perhaps amused, perhaps cautious, I'd say, replies that of course he would be welcome, only for the messenger to reveal himself as Harold, a small moment of theatrica that sets the tone for what follows, because this isn't simply a meeting of relatives, but of relative rivals who must, at least for the moment, pretend otherwise. By all accounts, the sagas say that their exchange is courteous, it's even warm on the surface, but beneath it would have lay calculation, because when Harold raises the question of dividing the kingdom between them, Magnus responds not with refusal, but with diplomacy, saying that he must consult his chieftains and consider the wishes of his people. It's an answer that delays rather than denies, which makes clear to Harold that nothing is going to be handed to him freely. Why would he? I would say that recognizing this, Harold then turns elsewhere, and he reaches out to Sven Estridsson, proposing an alliance and the renewal of war, a strategy that would actually allow him to force his way into power by exploiting the ongoing conflict between Norway and Denmark. But here again, the realities on the north intrude, because Magnus, for all his confidence, understands the limits of his position. Norway isn't a wealthy kingdom in the way that England or Byzantium is wealthy. Its resources are very limited. Its ability to sustain prolonged warfare is very uncertain, and although it may produce formidable warriors, those warriors still have to be paid and supplied and led. And the sagas say that faced with the prospect of renewed conflict against a man who now possesses enormous wealth, Magnus chooses negotiation over war. And what follows is one of the more striking scenes in the sagas, because I think it really captures not just a political settlement, but a contest of status. Harold lays out his gold in full view. He spreads it across an ox hide in a deliberate display, making visible the scale of what he's gathered during his years abroad. And as he does so, he reminds those present of the risks he has taken and the lands he has traveled to acquire it, before turning to Magnus and asking, in effect, what he can contribute in return. And of course, Magnus has very little. What he produces is a single gold arm ring, a very personal object given to him, he says, by his father, Olaf II of Norway. And the moment is charged with tension, because Harold's response is not simply dismissive, but pointed, suggesting that the ring itself may once have belonged to his own father, taken without right. And in that instant, the negotiation brushes against something deeper. I think it's a question of not just wealth, but of inheritance, of legitimacy, of who truly stands in the line of succession. And yet, despite all of that, despite the tension, there's an agreement. The kingdom is actually divided, the power is shared, at least in form, and for a very brief period, it seems that the potential for open conflict has actually been contained. though I think there are very few that would have believed that such an agreement would endure indefinitely, because the balance between them is too delicate. It's too dependent on circumstance, and it's too exposed to ambition. In the end, however, it's not ambition that breaks it, but something I think far less predictable. In 1047, whilst campaigning off the coast of Denmark, Magnus falls ill. And the sagas, true to form, give the moment a supernatural edge, describing how he dreams of his father, who offers him a choice between a long life marked by sin and a shorter one that leads directly to the afterlife. And Magnus, in the logic of the story, chooses the latter, only to wake, to fall into fever, and to die soon thereafter. His decision, whether literal or symbolic, sealing his fate. However, before he dies, he makes one final decision, of course, dividing what remains of his realm, granting Norway to Harald and Denmark to Suen. An act, I think, that brings an end to the uncertainty that has defined the previous years and places Harald at last where he always intended to be, the King of Norway. And really, Harald has been building to this his entire life. It's an accumulation of everything that has come before. The years of exile, the campaigns in the East, the accumulation of wealth, the incredible maneuvering in Constantinople, all of it conveying on this moment. And I think for a man driven as Harald has been and is, it represents not simply success, but fulfillment. And yet, as so is often in Harald's story, what follows doesn't quite match what has been achieved, because kingship, once gained, brings with it its own realities. And for Harald, those realities, they're defined not by triumph, but by reputation, by years of campaigning against Denmark that yield little beyond endurance. A long, grinding conflict, marked by raids and skirmishes, and I think the slow wearing down of men and resources, rather than the divisive victories that had actually characterized his entire early life. There are moments of grandeur, of course, not least in the great warship he commands, but even these stand against a backdrop of conflict that, for all its effort, actually changes very little. And so the man who had crossed continents, the man who had stood in the courts of emperors and carved his name into stories of distant lands, he actually finds himself engaged in something far more familiar, and I would say also far less satisfying. Basically, war without end. Because that, in the end, is what defines this phase of Harald's life. Not the dramatic victories of his youth, not the audacious episodes of Constantinople, but a very long, grinding conflict that stretches over the years, which drains his resources, his patience, and I would argue even his belief, until eventually he does something that had once seemed completely unlikely. He takes a step back. He abandons the larger ambition. He relinquishes his claim over Denmark. And he actually allows the balance to settle, not simply because he's been defeated in any decisive sense whatsoever, but because the cost of continuing has simply become too great, and I would say too tiring. But as he moves forward, cost is increasingly the central issue. Because during these years, Harald has not merely been fighting, he's been attempting something, I think, far more difficult, something less immediately visible, but ultimately more significant. The transformation of Norway itself into a more centralized, more structured kingdom, one that would be capable of sustaining the kind of power that he's come to understand from the south. And of course, this means things like taxation, organization, the slow imposition of authority over a landscape that actually resists it. And alongside it comes other changes, the developments of coinage, the encouragement of Christianity, the importation of priests and monks from the East. And of course, all of it pointing towards a vision of rule that's far less tribal, less local, and far more controlled. And I would argue that it's not difficult to see that appeal. A singular ruler, a single faith, a single structure of authority, reinforced not only by power, but by legitimacy. And I think here Harald has the advantage because his brother, half-brother, Olaf II of Norway, has already begun the transformation from king to saint. His memory enshrined, his legacy elevated into something that can be used, consciously or otherwise, to support the authority of the dynasty itself. But folks, Norway is not Constantinople, nor is it England. It's a land of difficult terrain, scattered power, and strong local identities, where the reach of the crown is never as complete as it might wish to be. And I think also where the imposition of taxes in particular meets resistance as a matter of policy, but also of principle. Landowners in the uplands and the central regions push back, unwilling to yield resources in a distant authority. And what might appear from one perspective as necessary reform, I think it appears from another as intrusion. And combined with that, I think Harald himself is also changing. The man who had once been the outsider, the adventurer, the ambitious exile, is now the king. And with that comes a shift in behavior that even sympathetic sources can't entirely disguise. Snorri Sturluson, who otherwise treats him with admiration, he notes at this stage that as Harald became more secure, he also becomes more imperious, more absolute, less inclined, I think, to tolerate disagreement until opposition itself becomes something far more dangerous. And for Harald, by 1064, farmers in the uplands are actually refusing outright to pay taxes. There's a tax revolt, if you like, that signals not just discontent, but resistance. It demands a response. And his response is never going to be a compromise. It's by force. So by 1065, as the war draws to its end, he turns on the regions that have resisted him and carries out a campaign of suppression that is as brutal as anything in his earlier life. A deliberate act of punishment designed not simply to restore order, but to make examples of. And the accounts are stark. Farmers are seized, some are mutilated, others are killed, many are stripped of everything they own. And it's a very harsh reassertion of authority that leaves no doubt whatsoever where power lies. It's effective, but it's not the act of a man at ease. The peasants pleaded for mercy, but his answer came in fire. His life in Norway has brought authority, but not the kind of glory that once defined him. And the long war with Denmark, the endless cycles of campaign and counter-campaign have yielded less, I think, than he might once have imagined. Around him, of course, life continues in quieter forms. His queen, Elisive of Kiev, she fades from the record, her presence largely lost to us, while another woman, Tora Torbergsdatter, bears him sons who will actually carry his line forward. And yet even here the sources grow very thin, as though the details of his domestic life matter less than the shadow of what is still to come. Because for a man like Harald, there's always something still to come. He stands by now almost as a figure out of time, I think shaped by older traditions of kingship and warfare, and he's a survivor of one world who finds himself ruling in another. And I can't help but feel that the great arc of his life hasn't yet quite reached its end. And that years of preparation, the battles, the exile, the accumulation of wealth and the reputation have all been leading, I don't think here, but somewhere else. And then in 1066, the moment arrives. Across the North Sea in England, Edward the Confessor dies. And with his death, the question of succession fractures the political world, drawing in rival claimants, ambitions, and long-held promises. Among those who see opportunity in that fracture is Harald Hardrada, because he too has a claim, a distant one perhaps, but real enough in a world where power often rests on the strength to assert it. And so once again, he does what he always does. He moves. He gathers ships and men and purpose and sails west, not as a raider this time, not as a mercenary, but as a king seeking another crown. His long life of war and ambition narrowing now towards one single decisive gamble. He lands in England and advances inland. And at first, as so often before, success seems to follow him because he defeats the northern earls at the Battle of Fulford, opening the road ahead and placing himself briefly in a position of real advantage. But history, as ever, has its own rhythm, because even as Harold advances, another king is already moving. Harold Godwinson marches north with extraordinary speed, covering ground that should not have been covered that quickly, arriving where he's not expected. And on the 25th of September, 1066, at Stamford Bridge, these two colossals collide. And in many ways, folks, this is the perfect ending to Harold's story. Not in a palace, not in old age, but in battle. The fighting is as fierce as you could imagine. It's very sudden and it's decisive. And in the chaos of that clash, Harald Hardrada, king, warrior, exile, and legend, is struck down. An arrow is said to have found his throat, ending his life in the way that he once have might imagined, at the height of action in that moment of decision. And I think also with him falls something far larger, because his death isn't just the end of a man, it's actually the end of an age. He's the last great Viking, cut down on English soil just days before another invasion, another battle, and another transformation. Because within weeks, William the Conqueror will land in the south, and at the Battle of Hastings, the fate of England will be decided once more, not by Norse ambition, but by Norman conquest. And so Harold's life closes where it was always heading, not in Norway, not in Constantinople, but in that narrow space between ambition and fate, where a man stands and fights and becomes, in the end, exactly what he had always wanted to be. This episode of Rearview Mirror Chronicles is brought to you by Entrepot Publishing, the home of independent storytelling. We publish books that celebrate history, art, and the extraordinary people who make life fascinating. You can find our titles and maybe your next great read at entrepotpublishing.com. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.